All right, so this thing is very loud. I'm going to try to ditch the mic if I can. Can you all hear me without it? Everybody hear me? Okay. So my name's Leah Van Meter Cardwell. I'm the FCS 4-H agent in McCreary County. So right across the Kentucky line, we partner with Scott County on this program. Tonight we are going to talk a little bit about food preservation. How many of you have preserved your food before? Okay. So food preservation, it covers a very broad area. We will talk tonight about water bath canning and pressure canning, but freezing your food, dehydrating your food, those are all forms of food preservation as well. If you all want, so tonight it's going to be an overview. We're not doing hands-on stuff. If you would like to come to a hands-on class, we will be having those at the McCreary County Extension Office this summer. So July 11th, which is a Tuesday, we'll be doing dehydrating from 1 to 3 o'clock. July 17th, we're going to do hot water bath canning, and that'll be from 1 to 3. And then on July 26th, we're going to do pressure canning, and that's a longer class, so it'll be from 10 to 2 that day. But you all are welcome to call our office and sign up for any of those. Yes?
What was your first day for the dehydration?
For dehydration, it is July 11th.
From
1 to 3. Yeah. And like I said, this is going to be an overview. Unfortunately, we don't have a big enough facility with all the stoves and all the equipment where you all could all do hands-on here. Space is limited in some of those classes, so if you want to do it, sign up early. But you will actually get to do hands-on activities with those classes. All right, so first we're going to talk a little bit about boiling water canning. So for me, this is the canning that I am most familiar with. This is the type of canning that Mom would get tomatoes, get tomato juice, and she would water bath can them. The pressure canner, my mama was afraid of that thing. Just a little bit, especially if any of us kids were around, and especially once she got her glass top stove. So I have not done as much with that. My history is more with water bath canning. Water bath canning is fairly simple. But I guess first we better talk about, why do you can your food? Why would you can your food? What reasons do you all have for canning food?
to have food later, to save money.
To have food later,
Good stuff.
to save money, and to actually enjoy the flavor of the foods, because it's different than what you can get at the store.
Preservatives in it that you don't need.
You know what you put in it if you can it yourself. What else?
With rising cost of food.
Rising cost of food, we're looking for ways we can save money. And it's nice to have some canned food put back, because, I mean, we're in Kentucky. Most of the time our weather is pretty mild, but every once in a while we get a good ice storm, a good snowstorm, a tornado comes through. If your power's out for a long period of time, any of our perishable foods is going to be gone, but that canned food we can still use. Some people like to do it because it's a family tradition. How many of you grew up canning with your mom, your grandma, maybe your great-grandma? I still remember, I was probably about 5 years old, breaking beans on the front porch with my mama, breaking them and stringing them to get them ready for canning. That's a family tradition in a sense, because it's been passed down throughout the years and through the generations. And then, of course, there's personal satisfaction that you get from doing something yourself. And this is whether we water bath can it, pressure can it, however we preserve it. You know what's in it. That's your work. You've put the work into growing it, and so now you want to be able to enjoy it longer. You just said the other day, or just a minute ago, you can only eat so much of one thing before you're sick of it. But then come October, November, December, you're really going to want some of that stuff again. And this is one way you can do it. So we've got a couple objectives tonight. The main one is I do want you all to know the research-based methods for food preservation. And then we're going to talk a little bit about high acid versus low acid food. We're going to talk about the proper tools for how to can, because unfortunately there are good ways to can and there's not so safe ways. And so we do want to talk about how to make this the safest that we possibly can. And then also how to actually correctly process your items, whether that's in the pressure canner or the boiling water bath, and what to do if your jars do not seal. Anybody ever done that? You've worked all day long in that kitchen, it's hot, you're sweaty, get up the next morning and half of them didn't seal right. What do? We're going to talk about it a little bit. And no, you do not have to throw them out or eat them right away. There are things we can do to save them. So research-based methods. This one is the most important thing. If you get nothing else out of this class tonight, it's what I want you to take home. It is very important that we follow the research with this. Microorganisms actually live on the surface of our fresh fruits and vegetables on our food. They're not harmful right now in the state that they are in. But if we were to can't put those foods up and not do something to deal with these, it can make us sick later on. The CDC, between 1996 and 2008, they did a study on home canned foods, and they found that home canned foods were actually, what did I do? Were actually the most common cause of foodborne illnesses, particularly botulism. Botulism can kill you. And so we want to make sure that we are not contributing to making somebody sick. We're doing this because we want healthy food, we want good, safe food. And so we want to make sure that it is safe and that we don't make anybody sick with how we do it. So by that, always use the research-based recommendations. Always use a research-based recipe. Even though we've got all these great recipes from mom, grandma, great-grandma that's been passed down, we want to make sure we're using those research-based ones because they've been tested to make sure that bacteria is not going to grow 3 months from now, 6 months from now. And so we'll have it and we know it's safe. A lot of those old recipes, they don't tell us how long to cook it, how much. There's a lot of things that have changed over time, and the research has actually gotten better because we've studied it more. So I will probably say it 10 more times, maybe 20 before the end of tonight. Always use research-based methods when you're doing any of this because we don't want to make anybody sick. And canning is one easy way that if we do something just a tad bit wrong, it could make somebody sick. And I don't say that to scare you, but just to emphasize how serious it is that we do this right. So a lot of the benefits of home canning can be reduced if we start out with something that's not in good shape to begin with. If we wait until our beans are starting to mold and turn brown, our green beans are not going to taste as good as if we canned them when we first picked them, right? Because we're losing that freshness that we're trying to preserve. Our jars failing to seal properly, that's going to take away from the benefit because it's letting some of that air, moisture, bacteria back into those jars. So we want to make sure they seal properly. Spoiled foods. And then also, we put a lot of work and time into this, so we want to try to preserve that flavor, that color, that texture. We want it to taste as close to as if it came out of the garden as it possibly can, right? We don't want to lose, we don't want it to be mush by the time we eat it. We actually want it to have, and we want to keep the nutrients as well. So there's two research-based methods for canning. Boiling water method, so that's basically what it sounds like. You take a big kettle. It does not have to be one like this. It can actually be just about any pot, large pot that you have in your kitchen. The main thing you will need is you need a rack in there to keep those jars off the bottom, because we don't want them banging into each other and we don't want them banging against the bottom of our pot. Once you've got that, you fill it full of water, make sure your jars are completely covered, and you boil the water and it will seal them. Pressure canning, you do need to use a pressure canner for that. Now, how many of you have pressure cookers or like electronic pressure cookers like the Instapot's the common one now? You cannot use those for canning. They are not safe. They're not approved for canning. And also, you cannot use your oven to dry can. It's not a research-based method. So we want to make sure that we actually use the pressure canner. If you get on TikTok, Facebook, social media, do a Google search, you will find all sorts of people claiming all sorts of things with canning. Don't believe them unless it's research-based. So if it says .gov.edu at the end of it, typically that's a safe source. If it's just some random person's blog, YouTube video, I would be very, very cautious about taking any advice from them on canning. And then with using a boiling water canner versus a pressure canner, that's going to depend on what we're canning. So if we're canning jellies, jams and jellies, anybody know which one we can use?
Boiling water.
Boiling water, yes. If we're canning green beans or corn, which one do we have to use? Pressure canner. What about tomatoes?
Water.
So tomatoes, we can use the boiling water, but the caveat to that is some tomatoes are more acidic than others, and because we're not testing the pH of each of those batches of tomatoes, we're going to have to add a little more acid to them. So typically that takes the form of like lime juice, lemon juice. And if it's an approved research-based recipe, it will tell you exactly how much to get you to that acidity point that you need to be at. Because tomatoes are actually, when we look at the pH, they're right on the line. They're kind of neutral. They're in the middle. And so if we're canning tomatoes, just to be safe, we want to push it all the way over into that acidic state so that no bacteria is going to grow if we water bath can. Yeah. And so that's where it says if the recipe has the addition of an acid. So that may take a lower acid food and make it more acidic. So research-based methods, in order to make sure that these are safe, the product is safe, we cannot change or modify those recipes. So you don't modify the recipe, we don't modify how we process it, and we do not modify the processing time. If it's a research-based recipe, it will tell you how long to do it if you're using pint jars, how long to do it if you're using quart jars, or whatever size jar you're using. It's going to make a difference on how long we process that in the canner. So research-based recipes will specify that. Now if you decide, hey, I want to do a half pint jar, we can't modify it using that recipe. You're gonna have to find another research-based recipe for half-pint jars. So we don't want to mess with any of it because that research that said it was safe is based on exactly what they say. I already talked about oven canning, pressure cookers, open kettle canning. So using just an open pot, that's not going to do the same thing as putting a lid on your boiling water canner. And then of course, steam canners. You can use a steam canner for high acidic foods or acidified foods with a pH that is lower than 4.6. So if you want more information on using a steam canner, there is a website. It's the NCHFP is what the website's called, but it's part of University of Georgia. They put out a whole publication. They've got a whole website devoted to safe canning. So fruits, they're naturally high acidic foods. That's why with our jams and jellies, our peaches, we can water bath can those. Tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, they can become highly acidic foods if we add citric acid, vinegar, lemon juice, something to bump that acidity up just a hair. And then boiling water is typically how we can most of these, but because it's adequate to inactivate the enzymes, some of those bacteria, destroying molds, yeast spores, it typically covers everything for those high acidic foods. So for fruits, tomatoes, anything that we add that extra acid to, like salsa, we can water bath can. We already talked about tomatoes. Some tomato varieties, depending on what you grow, we're not testing each one when we're canning it at home. Some are more acidic than others. Because I mean, how many of you grow yellow tomatoes? Typically those are considered less acidic than red tomatoes. Pink tomatoes, purple tomatoes, so specialty blends. We don't know exactly where they fall on that pH scale, and so to be safe, we want to make sure we get them all the way in the safe zone, not question it at all. So, like I said, USDA recommends adding an acid, so that's citric acid, lemon juice, vinegar, something in there to bump it up. And your recipe will specify which one works best with which fruits. So low acidic foods, that's going to be your meats and poultries. We can safely can meat and poultry items, but we have to use the pressure canner to do so. Seafood, milk, fresh vegetables, typically those fall in the low acidic range, and so we want to pressure can any of those. And the reason for that is we want them to reach that really, really high temperature that will kill the bacteria and those spores that cause botulism. If we do not reach that high temperature because they're low acid, that spore, that bacteria can grow. If it's not killed off, it can later make you sick. And like I said, boiling water canning cannot be used on these low acidic foods. So we pressure can all of them. They reach a high temperature and they have to be at that high temperature for a certain amount of time. And that's going to depend on your product. We may cook green beans longer than we cook tomatoes. We may cook potatoes longer than we cook the corn. So it's going to depend really on what that product is. but your recipe will tell you. And it's going to depend on the size of your container. And like I said, your recipe should specify that as well. So, boiling water canner, we've already said this. It can be any pan that is deep enough to cover the jars completely with at least 1 inch of water on top. So, if you're doing smaller jars, you may not need as tall a canner as that. We can stack our jars in the boiling water canner. We just want to put a rack between them to keep them from jostling together. And we still need that inch of water over the top of that second layer as well. So if we have an electric range, we want to make sure we have a flat bottom canner. And that's because if you have a glass top, if it's got ridges on it, if it's got bumps, if it's bowed in any way, that rattling with all that extra pressure or all that extra weight, you don't want to crack your stove top. That would not be a good day, and it would probably ruin your week. You can also use a glass range. Flat tops, you do want to be able to lift that canner up and not slide it across, because again, we don't want to scratch it. We also don't want to create any scratches that could possibly damage the structural integrity of that stovetop and make it more prone to breaking in the future. So always check your manual. Some flat tops you can use canners on, others they recommend not to. There is typically a weight capacity on those stove tops, and so if you exceed that multiple times, your stove top might start to tilt or start to sink in, and we don't want to mess it up. So like I said, smooth bottom pans you can use on your flat top. You don't want to use those rigid or those bumpy bottoms. So for equipment for boiling water canning, we need our boiling water canner. I don't know if you all can even see what I'm doing right now, but we also need our canning rack. So we need something in there to keep those jars separate and to keep them from jostling on the bottom of that pan. The lid, of course, is important. You will want a canning funnel. So if you've canned at all, you've probably used these. These are very nice because they help you avoid overfilling those jars, as well as keeping stuff off the top. Because once we get it in the jars, if we're canning, we've got to clean off the tops so that the lids will actually seal. We don't want to leave any extra food particles there. You need a flexible spatula, and that's just to get down in there and get those air bubbles out. You will want a jar lifter to pull them out. And the other thing, and it's not on the list, a headspace measurement tool. You can use a measuring tape or whatever you want, but this thing comes in handy way more because you can just set it on the side and drop it down, and it will tell you exactly how much headspace you've left in there. That's more important with pressure canning, but even with boiling water, we want to make sure we get the right headspace. We can't fill it all the way to the top and expect everything to go well. We actually have to leave a little space there. And typically, and then a timer. Of course, most of us have smartphones now, and those come with a handy timer right on them. So that's typically what I will use. And then you'll probably want paper towels, kitchen towels. If you're like me, you want a lot of towels because I will end up making a mess no matter how careful I am. And so I just plan for it. So at first you're gonna pre-fill your canner halfway full with water. you're gonna preheat it to about 180 degrees, and then you're gonna put your canning rack in there. So while you let that water preheat, you're gonna start preparing the product that you're gonna can. If you're gonna hot pack it or cold pack it, you need to decide and get that either heating up or ready to go in those jars. So we're gonna make sure we wash all our jars, our lids, and bands. You can wash those in the dishwasher, that works fine, but we wanna make sure that they're clean when we start. Because again, we're really worried about that food safety. We wanna make sure that there's nothing extra in there to make us possibly sick. And two, we don't want any random food particles mixing in. So if I'm canning jelly, I don't want corn from last year mixed in with that jelly to potentially ruin it. I want to make sure that that jelly turns out good. The lids that you use now, they are single-use lids. They have changed them in the last 10 years. And so those lids cannot be reused. You need to use new lids every year because they're just formulated now that once they've been heated up once, they're not gonna reseal. So make sure you use new lids. And if you question it, it's not worth that jar and that time that you're gonna put into it, get a new lid. Bands can be reused as long as there's no rust or dents, bumps on there that could potentially interfere with it. But as long as they're still in good shape, you can reuse your bands. So we can wash them in the dishwasher. You will need to process them for about 10 minutes, but they have to be sterilized for 10 minutes. So you can process them. So some things you don't have to actually sanitize them. Some of them, if you've got a really hot cycle on your dishwasher, that's gonna process them for you. They'll get them warmed up. So if we're putting stuff in them, it's not gonna shock them. But if you need to sanitize them, you actually need to put them in that boiling water. So once we do all that, we're ready to go into preparing our product. We're gonna actually inspect prepare our recipe. We're gonna make sure we look at our fresh fruits and vegetables. We don't wanna put anything in there that's already rotted. You can cut it up and keep it. So like growing up, my family grew 3 acres of strawberries. The strawberries that are starting to get soft make the best jam. You're gonna deal with some spots at that point. So you're just gonna cut out the bad spots and use the rest. That's not gonna hurt. The same is true with your vegetables. Just don't can the actual rotten stuff. Cut it off, chop it up. You can still use the product. Even if it's ugly tomatoes, those tomatoes that are not the prettiest, they make great canned tomatoes. So we've talked about using the funnels. We've talked about filling the jars. We want to make sure we fill it to the right level, leaving that space at top, and then we're going to clean the rim of that jar off so that our lids get a good seal. Like I said, you can either raw pack it or hot pack it. That's going to depend on your product. So for the more delicate foods, some foods, if you cook them too much, they turn to mush. We don't want that, so you may choose to raw pack those. Other foods, you may want to go ahead and cook. Corn, typically you can cook it a little bit, hot pack it, and it does fine. Potatoes, you cook those potatoes too long, and you end up with murky potato water instead of solid potatoes. So if you do raw pack it, you may have some shrinkage. And it may cause some of the foods to float to the top or it may, you may lose some of that headspace or get too high in your headspace. Also, hot packing can maintain color and flavor a little bit better than raw packing because we're locking that flavor and that or those nutrients in at that point. So hot packing, we're going to preheat the food for a certain amount of time. Again, that's in the recipe. We're going to place the hot food in hot jars. If you hot pack, do not put the hot food in cold jars. It's just a recipe for disaster. It can actually crack your jars if they have any type of nick or bump on them. So we want to make sure we preheat those jars as well as the food when we hot pack. Typically it will require fewer jars because when we cook our food, it typically shrinks down a little bit. And then it's going to get more of the air out. Because the food is hot when we put it in the canner, it's not going to take as long to get that water temperature up to boiling. And then of course it can maintain the color and flavor a little bit better. Headspace, I've talked about that. It is important to leave space between the top of the jar and the food. Less air results typically in higher quality. So for jams, juices, jellies, we need about 1/4 inch of headspace. For your high acidic foods like fruits, tomatoes, sauces, pickles, they're going to require 1/2 inch headspace. Low acidic foods like those vegetables and meats, you're going to need at least an inch or more of headspace in them. And then once they're packed in there, or once you get them in the container, you're going to remove those air bubbles. You do want to use a plastic spatula, plastic knife, something to do that. Because again, we're heating these jars to a really high temperature. If we make a blemish, hit that metal against the jar too hard, it could potentially crack our jars while we're canning. And we don't want that because then you've lost all that food that you put in that jar. And it just makes a big mess that you have to clean up later. Once you remove the air bubbles, you may have to add more product or liquid to get it back to that correct headspace height. Because once that air bubbles go out, it leaves more space for that food to settle down. It may actually get lower than what we need. So you may have to do this step a couple times to get it just right. We talked about the lids. They do have a sealing compound on it. It does not seal while it's in the pressure canner or the canner normally. It's going to seal once we take it out. So it's going to get on there. It's going to keep the water from being in there, but it's actually going to let that air escape while it heats up. So when you pull them out, it's very important that you keep those jars upright and set them straight over. A lot of people like to tilt those jars sideways to get the water off the top. Don't do that because it can mess up that seal and then you'll have to reprocess those jars. Ball and Kerr brand lids, you no longer have to soften those by heating them up. So used to, while we were canning, we would toss those lids in while the water was heating and it would soften them up. Don't do that now. Because like I said, those things are designed to heat up once. If we heat them up then, when we actually put them on our jars, they may not seal because we've already activated that compound that they have, and so they may no longer seal on those jars like what we want. So that's something that has changed. Now, that's for Ball and Kerr. Those are two of the most popular lids. Some of the other brands may be different, so make sure you look at those directions. This is again wiping the lid clean, placing the lid on the jar rim, put the ring on top. Once we do that, we want it to be finger tight but not screwed on super tight, because we still want some of that air to escape. So if you over tighten it, you can actually cause that metal lid to buckle during the heating process. And so, because all that air is trying to get out, we've tightened it so tight it has nowhere to go. The weakest thing in that jar is that metal lid, and so it may buckle and cause it to mess up your food. So you just want it tight and finger tight. You should not have to strain to tighten it at this point before you process. So when we boil water process, we're going to use that jar lifter to load them in there one at a time. A lot of us probably grew up just, carefully setting those in there by hand. You're better off using that jar lifter. It works really good. It also keeps you from getting steam burns, because those are no fun. Always keep them upright. That's to keep the food from spilling, but also to make sure we get a good seal. And we should not let those jars touch inside there, because again, we don't want them jostling into each other. That high heat, that high pressure, it can really fracture those jars very quickly. So then we're going to add water on top to make sure that our jars are covered. We're going to increase the heat, put the lid on, and begin timing once the water comes to a full boil. So we don't start timing when we put the jars in. We don't start timing when the water's over top them. We actually wait till it boils completely. It's at a full boil, meaning that bubbles are going everywhere, and then we have to maintain that for the entire time. So if your jars are in there, you hear it boiling, everything's going good, start your timer, and you'll go for the amount of time your recipe calls for. If at any point during that processing time it stops boiling, maybe your cooktop cut out for a while, maybe the power went off for some unknown reason, we're going to have to restart that process. So if it's interrupted, you will want to restart the process.
I've got a question. Okay, you lose power. Your jars cool down. Don't you have to re-seal them with the lid, because the lid possibly already may be
Yes.
turned?
Yeah, so we'll talk about that here in a minute when we talk about reprocessing our jars if they don't seal completely. But say for some reason the power flickers for just long enough for that water to, it's not cooled, our jars are still hot, it's just no longer fully boiling, we just restart that timer. We don't actually have to pull them out, put the lids back on, all of that at that moment. Now if those jars have set out on the counter overnight, that's a little bit of a different story. But where they're still in the canner and it's still hot, just not boiling, we can start the process as it is. We just have to get that heat back up, get our bowl going again, and start timing. So once they finish, we're going to actually turn off the heat. We're going to let that water, we're going to take the lid off so the heat escapes faster, and we're going to let it set for 5 minutes before we pull those jars out. We're not going to pull the jars out when they're still actively boiling. We're going to actually wait for that water to cool off just a little bit. Again, we want to use that jar lifter, keep them upright, place them on a towel, and leave some space in between them so that they can cool down. And at this point, you do not want to retighten those bands. A lot of times the bands will come loose during the processing. Don't touch them right now. We don't want to move that lid anyway. So if we go to tighten it, we may just nudge it enough that it breaks the seal that it was working on for me. So we want to leave it. You need to leave those jars undisturbed for at least 12 hours. They need to sit there. So if you're planning to eat supper at your kitchen table, don't put them on the kitchen table. A lot of people do that, and then it's like, oh, what are we going to eat tonight? I don't know. Pizza, yeah, we're going to the front porch, and everybody stay out of the kitchen because I don't want you messing up my cannon.
Do you have to check the water level periodically in the pot?
Typically, if you've got that inch of water above it, it's not going to mess with it during the processing time. Now, if you're doing multiple loads, so maybe you get one out and you start another one, make sure you check it before each time so that...
So you put hot water in there, you replenish it, right?
Yes.
Not cold water.
You don't want to put cold water in there just because it's going to take you forever and a day to get it hot again. So you do want to do hot water if you're replenishing it. A lot of times the easiest thing is to have another pot on your stove with some boiling water to pour over so it's not a drastic temperature change. It will save you time in the long run. If you have some that's already heated up a little bit before you pour it in. As we let it set, those vacuum seals will form. So they may not be sealed when you pull them out of the canner. A lot of times, a couple hours later, we start hearing that nice pop sound, and you know that they're starting to seal. And I always love to hear it because it's like, yes, it worked. I did it right. So after about 12 to 24 hours, 12 hours is fine. A lot of times, typically at home, we would leave them sitting there overnight and mess with them maybe mid-morning the next day. You want to give plenty of time for them to seal. After that, you're going to test those seals, make sure that they're all sealed, and then you can remove those bands. You don't actually have to keep them stored with the bands on. The bands are just there to keep the lid on while you're moving them. Once you get them on the shelf where you want them, those bands can be taken off. You want to wash down the jars and the lid surfaces because every once in a while you'll have a pesky little jar that likes to seep out a little extra, and then all your jars are coated in that good gritty stuff. Label and date your jars. That is one of the most important things. Otherwise, 10 years from now, you won't know if you canned that last year or 10 years ago. So make sure you label and date them. Also, label them with what's in it. Because we think, oh, I'm going to know that this is tomatoes. Well, in a few years, we may wonder, is this tomatoes with peppers? Did I add something extra to this? Like, what type of tomatoes is it? We want to just make sure so that we don't have to open up the jar to actually identify what's inside. And then we can store them up to 2 years. That's another reason why dating is important. The recipes are researched and tested up to 2 years of storage time.
At what temperatures?
That's typically in a cool, dark place. So your pantries, I would not leave them in a place that gets a lot of direct sunlight, not because it's going to make it unsafe, but because it's not going to look as good if it sits in the light all the time. So bottom cabinets, pantries, cellars, those are great places to store them. You don't want them in a place that's going to get extremely hot, like an attic, or a place that's going to get extremely cold, because those things can still freeze and they'll bust. Extremely hot, it's just not going to be good for the quality in the long run. So we know that the sealed jars are going to have a concave lid. That little button's going to be popped down. And then if they fail to seal, we're going to remove the jars or remove the lids from them. we're gonna double check those jar edges to make sure that there's no nicks or cracks that maybe kept it from sealing right. If there are, we're gonna change out those jars, wipe the rims off, add new lids to them, and then reprocess them within 24 hours. So we have a day that we can do it. And again, you'll go through the same process using the original processing time. So just because it's gone through the canner once, doesn't mean you get to cut half the time off. You have to use the entire time again because we've allowed it to cool, and any bacteria that was there to begin with is still there. If you do not want to reprocess it, so if it's one of the more delicate produce items, you might want to freeze it at that point instead, and you can do that. All you have to do for that is adjust the headspace. You can actually freeze it in those jars, but adjust your headspace to about 1.5 inches and then put a clean lid on top. Or you can stick it in the fridge and in the next couple days have that for dinner one day. It's already cooked, it's ready to go, but you need to use it up in a couple days if you do not reprocess it or freeze it. Okay, any questions on that right now?
If you messed up.
What'd I do?
Can you see in the can or whatever that it's already gone bad?
Sometimes. So that's the thing with like botulism or that botulinum bacteria. That one's invisible. You're not going to notice it typically.
You'll know that later on that evening, right?
Yeah, you know it after somebody gets sick and potentially really, really sick. But with some things, you'll notice that they've got mold in them. The liquid in the jar is really cloudy. At that point, you're not going to want to use it. But if we've done it by the recipe, we've processed it the right time, we know that those jars are sealed, we can be fairly certain that they're safe because we've done it exactly according to spec. So yes and no. Some things you will know that they've gone bad, but some things they don't have a scent, they don't have taste, they don't show up to our naked eye, and so that's why it's really important that we do it by those research-based recipes and don't just say, oh, I'll just smell it when I pull it out of the pantry. Well, some things we can't actually smell because they don't produce any type of scent. So we want to make sure we do it right as we're doing it and not leave it up to chance later. So pressure canners, a lot of the same equipment applies here. You'll still use those jar lifters, those funnels, canning racks. We're going to use that bubble remover, which really can be a plastic knife. It does not have to be fancy to be a bubble remover. Ladles to ladle it over in there. Timers, dishcloths, towels, paper towels, because we're dealing with water. We don't want that water all over our kitchen as we pour those jars out. With the canners, you will need some sort of gauge on there. This may be, yeah. So with pressure canners, some of them have what's called a pressure gauge, and it has the little needle on it. If you have one of those need to be tested every year. You can actually bring those to the extension office. We have a pressure canner tester, and so we can make sure that it's reading the correct pressure. So those need to be tested every year if you have one of those. You may also have, the technical name is a weighted gauge. I grew up calling them jigglers or rattlers, whatever. Because it rattles when it gets to the right weight. So if you have one of these, they do not have to be tested every year. Unless you have really, really misused a weighted gauge, it is going to be accurate basically forever. Now, if you've dropped it, thrown it against the wall, rode it in gravel for whatever reason, and it's nicked, that's going to throw off the weight and it may affect the measurement. But if you've actually just put it in the box with the canner, there's no big nicks out of it, it's going to be accurate and it does not have to be tested. A lot of people have pressure canners that their grandparents used. You can still use those, but they do not have some of the safety features that the newer ones do. So the newer pressure canners, growing up, my mama still does it to this day with her pressure cooker and her pressure canner. If she's using it, you better get out of the house because she don't want you in there, just because she's afraid something might happen. The newer pressure canners and cookers have safety features that will actually let it get rid of that, dissipate that pressure if it builds up too high too quickly. Most of them have some sort of button on them that will pop and release the pressure if it builds up too high. The older ones do not all have that. So that's why in like my grandma's mind, those pressure canners are dangerous because they really could explode if they built up too much pressure. The newer ones, the safety features on them do not allow them to get that hot. The newer ones also are typically lighter. So the benefit of that is you do not need your husband to stay in the kitchen to move that canner off the heat for you once you've got it processed. Those old ones, you need somebody tall and strong to pick it up and move it over. So if you are buying a pressure canner, make sure that it's got the approval by UL on it. And that just means that it meets the safety guidelines now. You can typically find pressure canners at flea markets, garage sales, something like that. You want to be very careful to double check if it's got those same safety features, because you don't want to potentially enter a dangerous thing into your own kitchen. So you do want to keep all of your documentation. You want to keep your manufacturer's instructions on how much water, because the amount needed will depend on that pressure canner. So some of them only need an inch or two of water in the bottom. Others require a whole lot more. And so that's going to be very canner specific. That's why we want to make sure we have those instructions. And like I said, you can find them at garage sales, flea markets, all over the place typically. It's not really recommended that we use those because we don't know how old they are, what they were used for, how they've been treated. And so if we're going to put that much time and effort into it, plus money, because jars are not cheap anymore, we want to make sure we get it right. Dial gauge and the weighted gauges. So typically weighted gauges are round. They have a counterweight. They'll jiggle several times per minute or rock once they're ready. And then as long as we don't drop it, we don't misuse it, or a vent isn't plugged, those things will typically read correctly. If you have one of these weighted gauge canners, the main thing you want to do is make sure that this hole for the vent is not blocked. And the easiest way to do that is just hold it up to the light. If it's blocked, pipe cleaners work really good for that, to clean them out. Yeah. So once we can, we're gonna do a lot of the same things we do with the water bath canning. You're gonna load them in there. You're gonna make sure that lid locks in place. Another thing with the pressure canners, it's gonna have a rubber gasket or seal inside. Make sure that thing is clean and in good shape before you put it up every year. Really, when you store it, it should not be in the lid. You should actually pull it out, clean it, make sure it's dry, and then put it down in your canner. Don't leave it in the lid. Make sure it's not broken, not dry rotted, not brittle. It still needs to be able to seal in order for this to work properly. So if we want it to vent, we want to leave that vent port uncovered. So as we're preheating it, we probably don't want to put our gauge on there just yet. We actually want to let some of the air out. We're going to heat it on high until the water boils. And then we're going to set a timer for 10 minutes once the steam continuously is coming through. So after 10 minutes of continuous steam, that's when we can actually put our gauge on top to begin building the pressure. So we want to actually let the steam come out for about 10 minutes first. So once you see a little bit of steam start doing pretty steady, then you're going to start that timer for 10 minutes. Once it's been steaming for 10 minutes, then you'll put your gauge back on or close that vent. So once we put that on there and it builds up pressure, that's when we're going to start our processing time. So we don't start our processing time immediately when we put that gauge on there. We actually have to wait till it gets to the right pressure to start our timing. The older canners, they can take over an hour to cool. Newer models, because they're lighter and the way that they're designed, they can actually cool a whole lot quicker. They have vent locks that will open when the pressure is at 0. So older models, you might have been able to knock that lid off if the pressure was still built up. These newer models, you're not getting that lid off even if you try, if the pressure is still built up. If you know it's cooled off, you know the pressure is gone and it still won't open, double check for some hidden locks because some of them are a little more tricky to open. And then loaded canners, they're heavy. Especially if you're short like me, trying to lift one of those big canners up when you're not very tall can be a struggle because you're lifting it over your shoulders. That's where it comes in handy to have somebody tall and strong as your apprentice that day. You rope them in just a little bit. Maybe you offer them a snack, I don't know, but you get them to move it for you. Because we do want to lift those things straight up. We don't want to tilt them because it can mess up our jars inside it. We don't want to slide it off the heat because it could potentially scratch our cooktop. And that's not a good thing either. There's all of the equipment. So that's always the first step, is to get all that together. We want to get our jars cleaned. We've talked about this with we talked about this with boiling water. So if we're processing those jars longer than 10 minutes, we don't have to boil them. If it's only going to be in our pressure canner processing for like 8 minutes, we need to boil those jars and make sure we get everything out of them. Okay. Again, we want to start with our fresh produce. Double check, make sure that there's nothing rotten in there. It would not be good to have a jar of potatoes and have one rotten potato in there that ruins the whole bunch, because that would just stink later on. prepare the recipe. Again, you can hot or raw pack them. We're going to put clean water in our pressure canner. We're going to put the canning rack in place. Using the funnels, we're going to fill them. We're going to measure the headspace, clean that rim, make sure that there's nothing on there, no nicks, anything that's going to prevent it from sealing. We've already talked about both of those. Again, headspace, jams and jellies, it's 1/4 inch. Fruits, tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, 1/2 inch. Vegetables and meat need at least 1 inch or more. Some recipes will call up to 1.5 inches, if not a little more. And that's going to depend on your recipes. Remove the bubbles, air out of them. Again, don't use a metal utensil because it could nick those jars and cause them to break later on. And then once we remove them, you may have to add more stuff to it. If you add more product to it, you have to remove the air bubbles again. Because as we pour it in there, air can get trapped once again. We want to get that all out. We talked about this. Place the lid on. Again, over tightening can cause it to buckle. We're going to put the water in 1 or 2 inches. So it's going to depend on your specific canner how much water you put in there. Some only call for that 1 or 2 inches. Some of them may call for 5 or 6. It's just going to depend on your specific one. We do want them upright. We don't want the food getting into that seal or around the rim and interfering with it. Fasten it securely. Again, leave that weight off. Heat it up on high until the water boils. And then again, we're going to start timing that 10 minutes once we see steam coming out continuously. After that, we're putting the weighted gauge or the closing that vent, and then it should pressurize within 3 to 10 minutes. If it does not pressurize in that time, something's gone wrong with the sealing of our pressure canner, and we're going to have to figure out what's happening. Some of the newer cooktops are really aggravating to deal with when you're trying to pressure can because they have a cycle on them with their heat, and so they will only go so long before they drop the heat, and it can make it hard to maintain a steady pressure. So if you have one of those, you may be in for some frustration with trying to can. So once the pressure reading is at the right pressure, if it's a pressure gauge, or once the weighted gauge begins to jiggle or do that rocking motion, then you're going to start timing for that processing time that's listed on your recipe. You do want to regulate the heat to maintain that steady pressure. So like I said, some of those newer cooktops, they're designed as a safety feature not to let it have high heat for a long period of time, and they go through a cycle. With this, where we're processing for up to maybe 65 minutes, if our pressure drops, it's going to throw it all off again. So loss of pressure at any time can result in unsafe food or under processing. And so if it's doing a lot of pressure losses, it can also cause us to lose some of the liquid in our jars. So if it drops below the recommended pounds, you're going to increase that heat to get it to the correct pressure, and you have to start that timer all over again. So maybe it was 65 minutes, we got 35 minutes through it, lost pressure. We got to start back at the beginning at 65. So, like I said, those new cooktops, even though I understand the safety of them, with canning, they can be a bear to mess with. Once it has finished, we want to remove that canner from the heat. We want to get it away from the heat. We want it to cool naturally. We do not want to force it to cool rapidly. And we want to allow it to depressurize on its own. So if we try to force the cooling process, we're in a hurry, we want to go to bed, it's midnight, we've been trying to get these jars done for hours, we could lose liquid, we could cause the seals to fail, or we may warp our canner. Yes?
Or your jars can explode.
Huh?
Or your jars can explode.
Or your jars could explode, yeah. So we want to make sure we let it cool off naturally. If you're trying to do a lot of pressure canning at one time, a lot of times it's better to have 2 canners, and so you can switch them out while one cools, you're starting the other one. That's the easiest way to get a lot done quickly. Forcing it to cool is not the way to get more done in a set amount of time. So we're going to wait until it completely depressurizes and the lid lock drops. So like I said, the newer ones, that lid's not going to come off until the pressure's done. But we want to let it cool off completely before we take that gauge off or open that vent. Then we're going to wait 10 more minutes to make sure that all that pressure and all that heat has escaped that needs to. And when you lift that lid off, always lift it up away from you. Do not lift it up towards you. Otherwise, you're getting a face full of steam, which sometimes you may not think's that bad, but that stuff is hot and steam can give you 3rd-degree burns. So we don't want to get burned and then, have to deal with that as well as leaving our jars unfinished. Remove them one at a time. Again, make sure you keep those jars upright. Like I said, a lot of people have the habit of trying to tilt them slightly to get that liquid off the top. Don't, because it can cause those lids to move. Place them on a towel. Make sure you leave space between them so that they cool down. And then leave them undisturbed. Those vacuum seals will form as they cool. And then only cover them if you have a large draft that can make them cool too quickly. So if your back door is open and it's late November and you're trying to can the last things and there's a really cool breeze coming through, you may want to put a towel over it. In June, we typically don't have to worry about a cold draft. After they set for 12 to 24 hours, we're going to test those seals, remove the bands, clean them off, label them, and then store them. And then, of course, we can reprocess them just like we did with the boiling water. Okay, spoilage. We do not want to use jars that have come unsealed. So maybe you put them up, 6 months later you're down there and you see that 3 of your tomato jars have the lids no longer sealed on it. Throw it away. When in doubt, throw it out. It's not worth chancing. We're going to clean those jars to get all that food that may have seeped out during the canning process off. So if you see dried food on the outside of the jar, that could indicate that some has seeped out. Throw it out. If you see air bubbles or cloudiness, they just look like an odd color. Maybe you canned corn and it's got a greenish tint to it. Throw it out. Don't question it, throw it out. If it spurts liquid, so if liquid starts kind of spouting out when you open it, that's a sign that something's gone wrong. If it smells bad, or if there's mold growth. So typically, if there is mold, it'll be right on top, or it'll be on your lid when you pull it off. So, now cloudiness is one that's harder to do. So you do want to use canning salt when you can, because if you use table salt, some of that cloudiness can come from the table salt because it's iodized, and that iodine in it will cause cloudiness when we can it. So if you use canning salt, typically your liquid should be clear. But if you know, oh, I didn't have canning salt today, I just want to get these glass jars done, it may be a little bit cloudy. Altitudes. Around here, we typically don't have to deal with these, but altitudes can actually affect how the canning process works. If you deal with altitudes greater than 1,000 feet, you just want to look at the Safe Home Canning publication or the website for the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And it'll give you the adjustments on the processing times and pressures. Okay? Any questions for me? Yes.
Go ahead.
Is there like a particular pressure canner that is recommended or something kind of, I mean, I'm sure there's something bottom of the barrel and then there's something that's off the charts. Is there some kind of?
There's not one that I can specifically recommend. The ones we have at the office are Presto. But if you get on this national, what was it called? It's the National Center for Home Food Preservation. They'll give you a better list of equipment and what to look for on there. As far as recipes to use, the Ball Blue Book is still considered one of the gold standards for canning recipes and food preservation in general. This website as well has a lot of recipes. The So Easy to Preserve cookbook, that's from the Extension University of Georgia. That one is a good one to use as well. And then we also have some food preservation workbooks like this. Those have safe recipes in them too. Or if you check with the extension office either here or in McCreary County, we can print you off recipes as well. So we can get you recipes if there's something specific that you're looking for. Now, every once in a while, somebody comes up with some unique item that I do not have a recipe for. And in that case, typically it's, well, maybe we try freezing that instead of canning that because we don't have research on it yet. Somebody else had a question.
On your gauge, do you need an appointment to
No.
have your gauge checked?
No, just, you may want to call ahead because sometimes I'm out of the office for different meetings. And so if you're making a trip over, just make sure I'm in the office so that I can test it for you. And if you do, you will want to bring your lid as well as the gauge with you. I do need to see both the lid and the gauge to test them.
You mentioned the CDC a lot. Are those the people that helped us through COVID?
I'm not going to go into that. But CDC, a lot of times their recommendations are what we consider standard as far as research. But a lot of these are tested by other universities, other places as well. They're not the primary source for a lot of the testing on this. Any other questions for me?
On your 1,000 feet, I went online and said, what's my elevation? And it came up with a place you put your address. A lot of our homes in Scott County are going to be higher than that.
Okay.
See, my house is at 1,300.
Yeah, so
We have quite a few that are going to be above that 1,000 feet mark. You can go online quite easily and get that. If you don't see how to do that, when you go online, you can call the office and Stephanie's going to say, what? I'm Warner, you may call, but we can help you get that with your address.
yeah.
You got a Garmin where it tells you what the distance traveled is, where you're going?
My husband does that, but I used my phone just then.
Just push it and tell you what your elevation is.
Yeah, so if your elevation is above that, it's gonna change it slightly just because water, the boiling temp of it changes at higher elevations. And so we wanna make sure we get that food actually hot enough and get it cooked right. Any other questions? All right.
Does she give you the information on using the sound and research-based recipes? The Scott County Extension Office, when Amber was here, she created a canning group. I know some of you, I've seen you in it. Yeah. But anyway, you can find us at Scott County Canning Group and request to be joined that. And she has a lot of files on there with good information.